The wealthy businessman left his devoted yet heavy-set wife for a younger, more glamorous woman who turned heads wherever she went. "You look like a whale. Get out of my life," he had spat, with no trace of regret. Years passed, and fate, as it often does, had a way of bringing people to their knees in sorrow and reflection. Evelyn Anderson stood before the grand window of her luxurious Manhattan penthouse, her eyes lost in the mesmerizing view of the city skyline. The twinkling lights stretched into the infinite horizon, a sea of endless possibilities. She had spent 3 decades in this very home, raising children, planning elaborate dinner parties, and waiting for Everett's return after countless business trips. This home had been the backdrop of both joyful memories and painful ones. Yet tonight, for the first time in all these years, Evelyn felt as though she was a stranger in her own space. The atmosphere was thick with an unspoken tension, and a silence that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Everett, perched in his beloved leather armchair by the flickering fire, held a glass of whiskey in one hand, his other idly scrolling through his phone. He barely acknowledged her presence. This had been their reality for months now. Distance, indifference, and a coldness that seemed to stretch wider with each passing day. Evelyn drew in a slow, steady breath, forcing herself to speak the words that had been swirling in her mind for what felt like an eternity. "Everett, we need to talk," she said, her voice calm though her heart raced with apprehension. He let out a long, frustrated sigh, placing his phone down with slow, deliberate movements. "About what?" he muttered, his voice dripping with impatience, as though her words were an unwelcome intrusion. She hesitated, unsure where to begin. She had replayed this conversation in her head 100 times, but now, with the weight of it before her, her mind felt blank, the words stuck in her throat. "About us," she said quietly but with certainty, "about how things have changed." Everett's lips curled into a mocking grin as he swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "Changed? Evelyn, let's not kid ourselves, things haven't just changed, they've ended." Her chest tightened painfully. "Ended?" Finally, he looked at her, and though his expression remained unreadable, there was a chilling coldness in his eyes, a detachment that felt like a dagger to the heart. "Yes, Evelyn. Ended." She felt a cold shiver crawl down her spine, the weight of his words sinking deep within her. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice faltering. Everett stood up, his movements deliberate and detached, adjusting the cuffs of his suit as though preparing for a boardroom presentation rather than the dismantling of their 30-year marriage. "I want a divorce," he said, his words final, as if he were issuing a simple command. The room seemed to hold its breath, the silence suffocating as the reality of what he had said hung in the air like an impenetrable fog. A sharp, bitter laugh escaped her lips, though it carried no trace of amusement. "Divorce? You can't possibly be serious." Everett exhaled sharply, as though she were nothing more than a child throwing a tantrum. "Oh, come on, Evelyn. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "Harder." Her voice wavered, but her heart was pounding. She had sacrificed everything for him, her aspirations, her career, her youth. She had stood by him through every triumph and every failure, believing in him, believing in them. And now, just like that, he was casting her aside as if she were a failed business venture, something easily discarded when no longer useful. "You can't be serious," she repeated, shaking her head in disbelief. This is just a rough patch. We can fix this. We've made it through worse." Everett rolled his eyes, his patience clearly worn thin. "Evelyn, stop being naive. There's nothing left to fix." The tears that burned behind her eyes threatened to spill over, but she clenched her jaw, determined to hold them back. "You made a vow to me. We built a life together, Everett, and now it's time to move on," he said coldly, his tone devoid of any warmth or remorse. "I deserve something better." The finality in his words struck her like a blow to the stomach. "Better?" she whispered, the word tasting foreign on her tongue. A smirk flickered at the corner of his lips, almost as though he were savoring her pain. "Savannah is better." A name. A single insignificant name that shattered everything she had known. Savannah. She had suspected, of course, but hearing it aloud, hearing the unmistakable certainty in his voice, made her feel as if the air had been sucked from the room. "You're leaving me for someone else?" she asked, her voice so small it barely registered. He shrugged, utterly unfazed. She's young, beautiful, exciting. His gaze swept over her dismissively, a look of distaste flickering across his face as though she were nothing more than an inconvenience. She reminds me of the woman you used to be. The words hit her like a slap, raw and stinging. She recoiled, instinctively wrapping her arms around herself as if to shield her bruised heart. She opened her mouth, ready to speak, to fight back against this cruel, soul-shattering revelation. But Everett wasn't finished. "You've changed, Evelyn," he continued, his voice oozing with cruel amusement. "You let yourself go. You're not the woman I married." He paused for a moment, savoring the silence, a smirk playing across his lips as though he were relishing every second of her discomfort. "You look like a whale." The words hung in the air, suffocating, as if the very atmosphere had been thickened by the venom they carried. Silence. A deafening, roaring silence that seemed to stretch on forever, filling every inch of the room and consuming every corner of her mind. The insult hit her like a physical blow, its sharpness cutting through her, leaving her breathless, disoriented, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her nails biting into her palms in an attempt to hold herself together. 30 years of unwavering love, loyalty, and devotion, all reduced to nothing more than her weight. Her self-worth, her entire existence in his eyes, was nothing more than a number on the scale. Everett, seeing her stunned expression, chuckled, the sound cold and condescending, before taking another slow sip of his whiskey. "Come on, Evelyn. Don't look so surprised. You had to know this was coming." Evelyn swallowed hard, forcing her legs to stand firm, even as her body trembled with the rawness of his cruelty. "You disgust me," she said, her voice far steadier than she felt, every word laced with the depth of her revulsion. He simply smiled, his expression devoid of any sign of guilt or regret. "That's fine, but you'll be out of this house by tomorrow." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "Tomorrow? You heard me," he said, the words falling from his lips with the finality of a verdict. "Take whatever you want, not that it matters. I've already updated the bank accounts. You won't have access to them anymore." A sharp gasp caught in her throat. "You cut me off?" "Of course," he replied with an almost casual shrug. "Savannah and I are starting a new life, and I don't intend to finance your pity party." Anger, fierce and unrelenting, surged through her veins, white-hot and blinding. Her chest rose and fell with each shallow breath, and she fought to keep her composure, but the fury coursing through her was impossible to ignore. "This is my home, Everett. I built this life with you, and now it's over," he responded, his tone devoid of emotion, as if they were discussing nothing more than the weather. Evelyn stood frozen, her eyes searching his face for something, anything that would reveal even the faintest glimmer of remorse or hesitation. But there was nothing. His gaze remained cold, calculating, entirely devoid of the man she once knew. She took a deep, shaky breath, gathering all the strength she could muster. "You'll regret this." He tilted his glass toward her in a mock salute, a smirk curling at the corners of his mouth. "Doubtful." She turned on her heel, her heart racing as she walked briskly toward the door. She refused to let him see her falter. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of witnessing her break. As she reached the hallway, Savannah's laughter floated from another room. Light, playful, the sound of someone unburdened by the weight of betrayal. Evelyn didn't stop. She didn't look back. With one last steadying breath, she opened the front door and stepped out into the night. The cold air stung her flushed cheeks, but the bustling city continued around her, oblivious to the seismic shift that had just taken place. Nothing had changed for them, but everything had changed for her. She had lost it all, or so she thought. Because, deep down, Evelyn knew one thing. One day, Everett Anderson would pay for the hurt he had caused. And Evelyn would rise from the ashes. The biting cold of the night sliced into Evelyn's skin as she stepped into the streets of Manhattan. The city was alive with its usual hum, indifferent to the crushing weight of her loss. She had walked out with nothing but the clothes on her back, her purse, and the crushing burden of a lifetime spent in service of a man who no longer cared. The doorman barely glanced at her as she passed, his face as unreadable as the building she had once called home. Just an hour ago, she had been the lady of this building, an important part of its high society. Now, she was nobody Evelyn. pulled her coat tighter around her, trying to shield herself from both the cold and the harsh reality of her new existence. Her heels clicked sharply against the pavement, a staccato rhythm that matched the uncertainty in her heart. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't go back. There was no home waiting for her, no family to turn to. For so many years, she had centered her world around Everett, sacrificing everything that made her herself for their marriage. Now, there was nothing left. No one left. Tears threatened to spill, but she held them back, refusing to let them fall. She wouldn't allow herself to crumble on the sidewalk like a character from some tragic love story. No, she had to keep moving, but where? The first person that came to Evelyn's mind was Lisa, her closest friend from years ago, before Everett had systematically isolated her from everyone who cared about her. Lisa had always been blunt, never hesitating to tell Evelyn when she was being too accommodating, too willing to prioritize Everett's needs over her own. Their friendship had slowly faded as time passed, but maybe, just maybe, Lisa would still help. With trembling hands, Evelyn pulled out her phone and dialed Lisa's number. It rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. "Evelyn?" Lisa sounded surprised, perhaps even a bit hesitant, like she was unsure of what to expect. Evelyn swallowed hard, trying to steady her voice. "Lisa, I need somewhere to stay, just for tonight." Her voice cracked, betraying the raw emotion she was struggling to keep contained. She hated herself for it. There was a long, painful silence on the other end of the line. "Evelyn, I don't know if that's a good idea," Lisa finally said, her tone cautious. A sharp, searing pain twisted in Evelyn's chest. "What? Why?" Lisa sighed, the sound heavy with frustration and old wounds. "It's not that I don't want to help you, but it's been years, and honestly, the last time I tried to warn you about Everett, you cut me off. You chose him over our friendship. Now you expect me to just open my door like nothing happened?" Evelyn's heart sank as she squeezed her eyes shut, the truth of Lisa's words cutting deeper than she was willing to admit. Lisa was right. She had ignored every warning, every concerned glance, every attempt Lisa had made to open her eyes to the reality of her situation. And now, with nowhere else to turn, it was too late. "I understand," Evelyn whispered, the weight of it all sinking in. There was a quiet pause before Lisa spoke again, her voice softer now, tinged with regret. "I hope you figure things out," but the call ended abruptly, leaving Evelyn staring at her phone in stunned silence. She felt more lost than ever. She tried another name, then another. Each call was met with polite rejection or vague excuses, none of them offering her the help she so desperately needed. The women she had once called friends had long moved on with their lives, and she was left with nothing, no one. Her family was gone, and the world around her felt more distant than ever. The weight of the situation was suffocating. She had nowhere to go. A gust of wind cut through her, sending a shiver down her spine as she realized she had walked farther than she thought. She found herself standing outside a 24-hour cafe, her feet aching and numb from the miles she had put between herself and the life she once knew. With no other option, she stepped inside, welcoming the warmth of the place as it enveloped her like a brief reprieve from the cold, both outside and within. She ordered the cheapest cup of coffee on the menu, then sat at a small table by the window, her eyes blankly staring out at a world that hadn't paused for a second, even as her entire life had crumbled. Hours slipped by unnoticed. She considered going back to the penthouse to demand her things, to reclaim at least some of her dignity, but she knew better than to fool herself. Everett wouldn't let her back in, not now. He had already erased her from his life. He had probably celebrated with Savannah the moment she walked out. Evelyn had never felt so insignificant, so utterly invisible. Her mind wandered back to the venomous words he had hurled at her, words that still burned in her memory like an open wound. "You look like a whale." Had she really changed so much? Had she let herself become someone unrecognizable, someone unworthy of love? She had spent so many years focused on holding their life together, on caring for him, caring for their family, that she hadn't noticed how far she had fallen from the woman she once was. She hadn't seen the way Everett had stopped looking at her the same way, how the touch that used to be tender had become a distant memory. The weight she had gained over time, the wrinkles that were inevitable with age, the stretch marks that marked the journey of motherhood. It was all evidence of a life spent giving everything to a man who had never truly loved her in return. The thought of it twisted her stomach into knots. She had given him everything, every ounce of her love, her strength, her devotion, and now she had nothing to show for it. As the night wore on, the cafe slowly emptied. At some point, the barista gave her a pitying glance and refilled her coffee without asking, as if she were a charity case. Evelyn knew she should leave, but where could she go? A hotel? She didn't have access to their bank accounts anymore. She had no job, no income, no means of support. For a moment, she considered calling Everett, begging for help. Anything, just to survive this night. But the very thought of it made her sick to her stomach. She couldn't lower herself to that level. She wouldn't. By the time the first light of day began to creep over the city, exhaustion had settled deeply into Evelyn's bones. She had spent the entire night at the cafe, wrapped in her own misery, her thoughts spiraling into despair. With a groan, she forced herself to stand, her limbs stiff, her head pounding from too much caffeine and too little sleep. She could barely focus, but she knew she had to think, to act. For years, she had been the woman Everett wanted her to be, the wife, the caretaker, the one who always put him first. But now, she had no choice but to figure out who she was without him. A small, almost imperceptible voice in the back of her mind whispered that this could be the start of something new, something better, a chance for her to reclaim herself. But a louder, more dominant voice reminded her that she was starting from nothing, and nothing, absolutely nothing, felt like an impossible place to begin again. She stepped out onto the sidewalk, taking a deep breath of the crisp morning air. The city moved around her, indifferent to the pain that had gripped her heart. People rushed by, intent on their daily routines. Suits, briefcases, coffee cups in hand, eyes fixed firmly on their phones, minds consumed by meetings and deadline. The world was moving on, as it always did, and Evelyn was just another woman in the crowd, a woman discarded by the man who had once promised her forever. She had no choice but to survive. But survival meant doing it alone. Her feet carried her through the bustling streets of Manhattan, aimlessly, her mind fogged by exhaustion and memories that wouldn't leave her in peace. The weight of the reality she now faced crushed her chest, making it hard to think clearly, to focus on any plan. She had no home, no money, no one to turn to. The realization sank in like a cold stone, pressing down on her heart, suffocating any hope that remained. Eventually, her wandering feet brought her to a small park. She sank onto a bench, feeling the weariness in every fiber of her being. She watched as children played nearby, their laughter light and carefree, while their parents sipped coffee and chatted idly. A few years ago, she would have been one of them. Comfortable, secure, and blissfully unaware of how quickly life could rip everything away. Everything away, her stomach grumbled, the reminder that she hadn't eaten since the afternoon before settling heavily in her chest. With a sigh, she reached into her purse and pulled out the few crumpled bills she had left. It wasn't much, and she knew she'd have to be careful. Her eyes drifted across the street to a small bakery. The smell of fresh bread and brewing coffee wafted toward her, wrapping around her like a fleeting memory of simpler times, of mornings when things felt right. She hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, the warmth of the place enveloping her immediately. The soft hum of conversation, the rhythmic sound of dough being kneaded behind the counter, it all felt like a small sanctuary amidst the chaos of her life. The young cashier greeted her with a polite smile. "Good morning, what can I get for you?" Evelyn hesitated, looking at the pastries in the display case. They looked divine, golden, flaky, dusted with powdered sugar or drizzled with rich chocolate. She used to buy a dozen without a second thought, indulging herself without guilt. Now she counted every cent, each one feeling more precious than the last. "Just a small coffee, please," she said, her voice quieter than usual, barely above a whisper. The cashier rang her up and Evelyn paid, leaving her with only a few dollars to her name. She took her coffee and walked to a corner table, wrapping her hands around the warm cup, trying to absorb its heat as if it could thaw the coldness she felt inside. She didn't notice the older man behind the counter watching her. He was in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes, his apron dusted with flour. He had been kneading dough when she walked in, but something about her made him pause, an instinct telling him that she needed something more than just a cup of coffee. A few minutes later, he approached her table, setting a small, freshly baked croissant in front of her. "It's on the house," he said before she could protest. "You look like you could use a little kindness." Evelyn stared at the croissant, then looked up at the man. Her throat tightened with emotion, the unexpected gesture almost too much to bear. She had spent the past 24 hours being discarded, rejected, and ignored. A simple act of kindness, something so small, nearly shattered her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. The man smiled warmly, then pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "My name's Theodore. I own this place." Evelyn nodded, unsure of what to say. She wasn't used to accepting charity. She had always been the one to give, to help, never the one on the receiving end. But something about this man's quiet compassion made her feel like she wasn't as invisible as she'd thought. Theodore gestured toward her barely touched coffee. "Long night?" "You could say that," Evelyn admitted, her voice hollow. "Rough mornings tend to follow," he said, his eyes soft and filled with understanding. "Let me guess, something big happened? Turned your world upside down?" Evelyn let out a humorless laugh. "That obvious?" He nodded gently. "You remind me of someone I used to know." She looked down at her hands, feeling the weight of his words. "I lost everything last night," she confessed, her voice quiet. "Everything?" he asked, raising an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. She exhaled sharply, trying to push the knot in her throat aside. "My marriage, my home, my sense of direction, apparently." Theodore studied her for a long moment, his eyes thoughtful and kind, before he leaned back in his chair. "You know what's funny about hitting rock bottom?" Evelyn met his gaze, unsure of what to expect. "There's nowhere to go but up." She wanted to believe him. She really did. But right now, all she could see was the vast emptiness where her life used to be. The hole where her future had once been filled with plans and dreams. Theodore stood, a reassuring smile on his face as he patted the table. No use thinking on an empty stomach. He turned and returned to the kitchen, leaving her alone with her thoughts and with the soft comfort of the croissant before her. Evelyn took a tentative bite, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to feel something other than the crushing weight of despair. The croissant was warm, buttery, and comforting in a way she hadn't expected. A small, unexpected piece of solace. Maybe Theodore was right. Maybe there was nowhere to go but up. By the time she finished eating, something had shifted inside her. She had made a decision. She couldn't keep walking aimlessly, waiting for her luck to change. She had to do something, anything, to move forward. With a determined breath, Evelyn stood and walked up to the counter. Theodore glanced up, surprised to see her still there, lingering in the warmth of the bakery. "Do you need help around here?" she asked, forcing confidence into her voice, even though doubt lingered just beneath the surface. "I can work hard. I just need a chance." Theodore paused, considering her for a moment before nodding. "Come back tomorrow at 5 a.m. We'll see what you can do." Relief flooded through her chest, a lightness she hadn't felt in days. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She left the bakery feeling lighter than she had in days. It was a small step, but it was movement. And for now, that was enough. The city was still cloaked in darkness when Evelyn arrived at the bakery the next morning. The air was crisp, the streets quieter than usual, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she had a destination, a purpose. Theodore was already inside when she pushed open the heavy wooden door, and the familiar scent of freshly baked bread greeted her, wrapping around her like a warm embrace. He glanced up from a tray of donuts and nodded. "Right on time," he said with approving smile. "That's a good start." Evelyn gave a small, nervous smile in return. She had never worked in a bakery before, never spent hours on her feet kneading dough or frosting cakes, but she was willing to learn. She had to. Theodore handed her an apron. "First things first, have you ever made coffee?" She nodded, feeling a bit more confident. "I used to host charity brunches and dinners. I wasn't in the kitchen much, but I know the basics." He chuckled. "I think you'll do just fine." Well, let's see if you can handle a commercial machine," Theodore said with a grin, leading Evelyn to the espresso machine. "Mornings are chaos here, and people take their coffee very seriously." Evelyn followed him, her focus on every step as he demonstrated. She mimicked his movements carefully, but her first attempt at a latte came out with too much foam. The second attempt, too bitter. "Not bad for a beginner," Theodore said, sipping the third cup she made. "You'll get the hang of it." Evelyn wasn't sure if he was being kind or honest, but she appreciated it either way. As the morning rush hit, she was thrown into the deep end. Orders flew at her from every direction: cappuccinos, Americanos, pastries by the dozen. She fumbled at first, spilling a drink, forgetting to ring up an order. But Theodore never raised his voice. He corrected her mistakes patiently, showing her how to move efficiently behind the counter. By mid-morning, sweat clung to the back of her neck, and her arms ached from lifting trays and grinding coffee beans. It was exhausting. Nothing like the life she had lived before. But strangely, it felt grounding, real. At noon, Theodore finally waved her toward the back. "Take a break before you collapse," he said with a chuckle. Evelyn sank onto a stool in the kitchen, rolling her sore shoulders. She hadn't worked like this in years, hadn't had to. But strangely, it felt good, like she was earning something for herself, not just existing in the shadow of someone else's success. A young woman entered the kitchen, carrying a fresh tray of cookies. She was in her early 20s, with dark curls and bright eyes full of curiosity. "You're new," she said, setting the tray down. Evelyn nodded. "First day. I'm Stella," the girl said, wiping her hands on her apron. "How's it going so far?" Evelyn let out a breathless laugh. "Well, I haven't been fired yet, so I'd say it's going okay." Stella grinned, her eyes twinkling. "Theodore doesn't hire just anyone. If you're here, it's because he sees something in you." Evelyn glanced toward the kitchen door, where she could hear Theodore chatting with a regular customer. She wasn't sure what he saw in her, probably just a desperate woman in need of a job. But she was grateful Stella sat beside her, breaking the silence. "You don't seem like the bakery type." Evelyn hesitated. She had spent so long being Mrs. Everett Anderson, the elegant wife of a wealthy businessman, that she wasn't sure how to describe herself anymore. "Let's just say," she finally said, her voice quieter than before, "I'm figuring things out." Stella nodded, a look of quiet understanding in her eyes, as if she knew exactly what Evelyn meant, even if she didn't know the details. "Well, if you ever need help with anything, just ask. We're a family here." A lump formed in Evelyn's throat at those words. Family she had been cast out of, the one she built, discarded like she was nothing. But here, in this small, warm bakery, surrounded by strangers who were showing her more kindness than she had felt in years, she felt something unfamiliar, something like belonging. Her break ended too soon, and she returned to work, throwing herself into the rhythm of the shop. By the time the afternoon lull arrived, she was exhausted, but proud. She had made it through her first day. The Theodore leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his gaze appraising. "Not bad, Anderson," he said, calling her by her last name the way a coach might address a player. "Think you can handle another shift tomorrow?" Evelyn wiped her hands on her apron, nodding with a small smile. "I'd like that." "Good. Be here at 5. Evelyn walked out of the bakery that evening, feeling lighter than she had in days. She still had no home, no savings, no concrete plan beyond this job. But for the first time since Everett had thrown her away, she wasn't drifting aimlessly anymore. She had work, she had purpose, and she had the smallest flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could build something of her own. The days at the bakery followed a steady rhythm, one that Evelyn slowly found herself falling into with unexpected ease. Every morning she arrived before dawn, tying her apron and breathing in the comforting scent of fresh dough and roasted coffee. It was a routine she never imagined she would have, yet something about it grounded her in a way she desperately needed. Her body ached in places she hadn't noticed before, her back from bending over trays, her wrists from kneading dough, her feet from standing for hours. It was exhausting, but there was a strange satisfaction in it. Unlike her past life, where every luxury had been handed to her, this was something she was earning. Theodore proved to be a patient teacher, though he had little tolerance for hesitation. If she made a mistake, he expected her to fix it without dwelling on it. "Too much flour," he grumbled one morning as he watched her struggle with a batch of bread dough. She frowned, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "It looks fine to me." Theodore arched an eyebrow, slicing a piece from the dough and stretching it between his fingers. See how it's breaking instead of stretching? That's because you overworked it. Bread needs balance. Too much force and it becomes tough. Too little and it falls apart. Evelyn sighed, wiping flour from her hands. I never realized baking was so delicate. Life is delicate, he mused, kneading his own batch effortlessly. You push too hard and you ruin something good. You don't try hard enough and you get nothing. He glanced at her with a knowing look. Kinda like people, huh? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down at her ruined dough, pressing her fingers into its uneven surface. Balance she had spent years tipping the scales too far in one direction, giving everything she had to a man who had taken it all for granted. Try again, Theodore instructed, handing her a fresh batch. So she did. Mornings were the hardest, the rush of customers leaving no room for mistakes. She fumbled at first, spilling coffee, forgetting orders, moving too slowly. But she was learning, adapting. She discovered that people were particular about their pastries. Some wanted their croissants extra flaky. Others insisted on exactly the right amount of icing on their cinnamon rolls. Stella, who had quickly become her closest ally, took it upon herself to make sure Evelyn didn't drown in her mistakes. You have to own the counter, she said one morning as they worked side by side. Confidence is everything. If you hesitate, customers eat you alive. Evelyn smirked. It's just coffee, Stella, not war. Stella rolled her eyes. Oh, sweetheart, you've never seen a New Yorker before their first cup of coffee. It's a war zone. Evelyn laughed. A sound that felt like a release, something she hadn't done in what felt like years, but the laughter didn't erase the questions that still lingered in her mind. One evening, after the bakery had closed, Evelyn found herself lingering by the counter, wiping it down even though it was already clean. Theodore noticed, leaning against the doorway with his arms crossed. You're thinking too hard, he observed. She glanced up, offering him a tired smile. That obvious? You've got that look, like there's a storm in your head. Evelyn set down the cloth, hesitating. I guess I don't know where this is going. Theodore studied her for a moment before stepping forward, nodding toward the kitchen. Come with me. She followed him into the back, where the scent of cooling bread filled the air. He pulled out a stool and motioned for her to sit before grabbing a loaf of sourdough from the counter. You know why I opened this place? He asked, slicing the bread carefully. She shook her head. Theodore handed her a piece before taking one for himself. I spent 30 years in finance, made good money, but my wife, she got sick. I spent so much time chasing success that I barely noticed how much time was slipping away. Evelyn swallowed, the weight of his words settling heavily on her heart. She knew that feeling all too well. When she passed, he continued, I realized I'd built a life that meant nothing without her, so I walked away from it all and started fresh. He gestured around them. This bakery, it's not about money, it's about creating something real. Evelyn ran her fingers over the grain of the wooden counter. You make it sound so easy, Theodore chuckled. It wasn't. But nothing worth having ever is. Silence stretched between them before he asked, So, what do you want, Anderson? She opened her mouth, but no words came out. For so long, her identity had been wrapped around Everett, his success, his world. She had never allowed herself to dream outside of that. But now, something inside her stirred. I think, she hesitated, then took a deep breath. I think I want to learn. Learn? Theodore raised an eyebrow. Not just how to work here, but really learn how to do this, how to bake, how to run a place like this. Theodore's smile was slow, approving. Now that is the best thing I've heard all week. Something in her chest lightened. For the first time since her world collapsed, she wasn't just surviving. She was planning. And for once it had nothing to do with Everett. The scent of vanilla and cinnamon filled the bakery as Evelyn carefully pulled a tray of pastries from the oven. The golden brown crusts shimmered under the kitchen lights, each one a small triumph of patience and precision. She placed them gently on the cooling rack, stepping back to admire her work. It had been weeks since Theodore had first placed a lump of dough in front of her and told her to try again. Weeks of waking up before the sun, of burning her hands, of throwing out failed batches, Of watching, learning. She had ruined more pastries than she cared to admit. But with each mistake, she had learned something new. Now, standing in the warmth of the kitchen, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Pride, Theodore, entered just as she was arranging the pastries neatly in rows. He crossed his arms, tilting his head as he studied them with his usual scrutinizing eye. "Not bad," he said, his voice neutral but not unkind. Evelyn smirked. "Just not bad? I was hoping for something a little more enthusiastic." Theodore let out a low chuckle. "Let's see how they taste first." He picked up one of the pastries and took a slow, deliberate bite. Evelyn watched him closely, her fingers twitching against the counter as he chewed. Finally, he looked at her. "You finally got it," relief flooded her chest. "Really?" He nodded. "You found the balance, the texture, the flavor, everything works." She exhaled, a grin spreading across her face. This wasn't just about making pastries. It was about proving to herself that she could do something, create something with her own hands and have it be good. Stella peeked into the kitchen, her eyes widening when she saw the tray. "Are those yours?" Evelyn nodded. Stella grabbed one before Evelyn could protest, taking a big bite. Her eyes lit up instantly. "Ooh, oh my God, these are amazing." Theodore smirked. "Told you." Evelyn could hardly believe it. Just weeks ago, she had walked into this bakery, lost, unsure, feeling like a failure. And now people were enjoying something she had made. The next morning when Evelyn arrived at work, she found Theodore placing her pastries in the front display case, alongside the bakery's usual selection. She hadn't expected him to sell them. She had assumed they were just another lesson, a personal Theodore experiment, nothing more. But as she tied her apron and prepared for the morning rush, she saw something that made her stomach flip. Half the tray was already empty. Stella grinned at her from behind the counter. "People love them. We had a couple customers asking if we had more." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," Stella said, nodding toward a woman standing at the counter. "Watch." Evelyn turned just in time to see a well-dressed woman in her 50s point at the tray. "I'll take 2 more of those," she said to Theodore. "Who made them?" Theodore glanced at Evelyn. She did. The woman's eyebrows lifted slightly. She turned to Evelyn and smiled. "They're wonderful." Evelyn could barely speak. She managed a soft thank you as the woman took her bag and walked out. Theodora patted a hand on her shoulder. "Told you, people know quality when they taste it." Evelyn wasn't sure what she had expected. Maybe that her pastries would go unnoticed, or that people would be polite but unimpressed. But the realization that real customers were enjoying something she made filled her with a confidence she hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, she felt capable. As the day went on, the pastries continued to sell. More than once, customers specifically asked for them, some even requesting to know when they would be available again. Each compliment, each satisfied smile, added another layer of confidence to the foundation she was rebuilding for herself. By closing time, the tray was completely empty. That evening, after locking up, she sat across from Theodore in the kitchen, a fresh notebook open in front of her. "I want to learn more," she said. Theodore smirked. "You're already learning. I mean, more than just baking, I want to understand the business side of it, how to manage a place like this, how to run it properly." Theodore leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You thinking of opening your own place one day?" The question made her pause. She hadn't let herself think that far ahead. When she first stepped into the bakery, she had been lost, broken, desperate for any kind of stability. But now, for the first time, she was thinking beyond survival. "Maybe," she admitted, "someday." Theodore nodded, clearly pleased with her answer. "All right, Anderson, let's start with the basics." That night, as she walked home, the city lights stretching endlessly above her, she allowed herself a thought that once would have felt impossible. She didn't need Everett. She didn't need his money, his validation, his approval. She was building something new. And this time it was hers. The rhythm of the bakery became second nature to Evelyn. Mornings were a whirlwind of activity, the air thick with the scent of espresso and fresh bread, customers lining up before the doors even opened. She had learned to move quickly, efficiently, her hands no longer fumbling when she shaped dough or poured steamed milk into coffee cups. There was a grace to the chaos now, a familiarity she never thought she would find in a place like this. But beyond the work itself, something else was changing. She caught glimpses of herself in the bakery's glass display case or the kitchen's stainless steel surfaces and barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Her face had a new sharpness to it, the softness of complacency replaced with the determination of someone who had rebuilt herself from nothing. The tired, uncertain expression that had once defined her was fading, replaced by something stronger. Her clothes, once chosen to please Everett, had gradually shifted too. Gone were the stiff designer blouses and heels that had been more about appearances than comfort. Now, she wore simple but practical outfits, rolled-up sleeves, sneakers that let her move quickly, an apron that no longer felt foreign on her. She wasn't just working at the bakery anymore. She was becoming part of it. Theodore noticed the change before she did. "You're not the same woman who walked in here a couple of months ago," he said one afternoon, watching as she expertly frosted a batch of cupcakes. "Huh," Evelyn glanced up, arching an eyebrow. "Huh, that a good thing?" he smirked. "Depends. You planning on sticking around, or are you just passing through?" She paused. The old Evelyn would have hesitated, unsure of herself, afraid to claim something as her own. But now, she met his gaze without wavering. "I'm not going anywhere." Theodore nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer, and tossed her a towel. "Good. Then it's time you start learning how to run a business, not just bake in one." That night, instead of going home after closing, she stayed behind in the office, where Theodore pulled out folders, receipts, and notebooks filled with figures and notes. "Running a bakery isn't just about making good pastries," he explained, flipping open a ledger. "It's about numbers, inventory, expenses, profit margins. You don't keep track of these and you'll bleed money before you even realize it." Evelyn sat beside him, listening intently as he explained the financial side of things. The cost of ingredients, how to price items to make a profit, how to manage employee wages and store overhead. It was overwhelming at first, but she took notes, absorbing every word. She realized something as he spoke. This knowledge, this power, had been kept from her before. Everett had controlled their finances, made all the decisions. She had spent years living in a beautiful home without truly understanding what kept it running. But now she was learning. As the weeks passed, Evelyn became more involved in every aspect of the bakery. She experimented with recipes, developed new flavors, and even suggested changes to the menu based on customer preferences. Theodore let her take risks, trusting her instincts. One morning, she arrived early, her heart pounding with excitement. She had spent the previous night perfecting a new pastry, one she had dreamed up on her own, without Theodore's guidance. It was a delicate, flaky pastry filled with rich chocolate and a hint of orange zest, topped with caramelized sugar. It was unlike anything the bakery currently offered, and she had no idea if customers would like it. But she wanted to try. She placed the fresh batch in the display case before the doors opened and waited. The first sale happened quickly. An older woman, who always ordered a black coffee and a croissant, pointed at the pastry curiously. "What's this?" Evelyn cleared her throat. "It's a new pastry we're testing out. Would you like to try one?" The woman nodded, and Evelyn held her breath as she took the first bite. A pause, then a pleased hum. "This is wonderful." Evelyn exhaled, relief washing over her. As the day went on, more customers tried it, some even returning to buy extras. By noon, the tray was empty. Theodore watched from the counter, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. When the last one was sold, he walked over to her. "You're putting that on the menu?" he said simply. Her heart swelled. She had done it. She had created something that people wanted, something that was hers. Later that night, after closing, she sat at one of the empty tables, staring at the bakery as if seeing it for the first time. Stella plopped down beside her, nudging her shoulder. "You look like someone who just realized they can actually do something with their life," Evelyn laughed. "Maybe I did. Feels good, huh?" She nodded. "Yeah, it really does." For the first time since Everett had thrown her out, she felt like she had a future, and more than that, she felt like she was in control of it. Evelyn had found a rhythm in her new life. The bakery wasn't just a job anymore. It was a place where she belonged. Each morning, as she tied her apron and stood behind the counter, she felt a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. The pastries she made, the coffee she poured, the customers she greeted, all of it felt real, more real than anything she had lived through in her previous life as Everett Anderson's wife. Her new pastry had become a bestseller. Customers asked for it by name, some even bringing friends just to try it. Theodore made it an official part of the menu, writing Evelyn's special on the chalkboard above the counter in his careful, precise handwriting. Seeing her name there, associated with something she had created, filled her with a quiet pride she never expected. But just as she was beginning to feel secure in this new world she was building, the past found a way to creep back in. It started with a familiar voice. She had been wiping down the tables near the front window when she heard a laugh, sharp, artificial, laced with a cruel amusement she recognized instantly. Savannah. The sound froze her in place. She hadn't seen or heard anything about Savannah since the night Everett had thrown her out. For a moment she thought she might be imagining it, but then the voice came again, followed by a light, dismissive giggle. "Gosh, this place is quaint," Savannah said, the word dripping with condescension. "I don't know why I let you drag me here." Evelyn turned slowly, her fingers gripping the cloth in her hands. Through the bakery's large window she saw Savannah standing just outside, her arms crossed as she examined the storefront with thinly veiled disdain. She hadn't changed much, still impossibly polished, still effortlessly beautiful in that expensive, curated way. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her lips painted a deep red that matched the high heels clicking against the pavement. But something about her looked off. Evelyn recognized it instantly. Stressed Savannah might have looked the same on the surface, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of tension behind the practiced smile. The way she tapped her manicured nails against her arm, as if trying to mask impatience. And then Evelyn saw him. Everett? He stood beside Savannah, his face carefully blank, his expression more tired than she had ever seen it. There was no warmth in his eyes, no smug arrogance like the night he had cast her aside. His tailored suit, though still expensive, looked slightly less crisp, as if he hadn't been paying attention to the details the way he used to. Savannah, on the other hand, was overcompensating. She looped her arm through his, flashing a smile up at him. "Come on, baby, let's go somewhere else," she said. "Somewhere with, a little Vivian-ness." Evelyn clenched her jaw. She had known this moment would come eventually, that their paths would cross again, but she hadn't expected it to happen here, at the bakery, in the world she had built for herself. For a split second, she debated hiding, slipping into the back room before they saw her, but no, that wasn't who she was anymore. She would not disappear for them. So instead, she squared her shoulders and walked straight toward the door. She opened it just as Savannah turned toward Everett again, flipping her hair over her shoulder. "I mean, really?" she scoffed. "Who even eats at a place like—" She stopped mid-sentence. Her eyes met Evelyn's, and for the first time since she had known the woman, Savannah was speechless. For a moment, the two of them just stared at each other. The weight of their shared history hung in the air like an unspoken challenge. Evelyn saw it happen, the flicker of surprise in Savannah's face as she took her in, as she noticed the changes. Evelyn wasn't the same woman Savannah had sneered at in Everett's penthouse that night. She was thinner now, not because she had forced herself into some ideal, but because the months of working, moving, and building a life had naturally reshaped her. Her posture was different too, more sure of herself, more rooted. The woman Savannah had seen before had been fragile, broken, discarded. Evelyn was stronger, and Savannah hated it. Evelyn could see it. The way she tightened her grip on Everett's arm, how her perfectly lined lips pursed ever so slightly, how her shoulders stiffened. Everett hesitated, finally breaking the silence. "Evelyn." His voice was quieter than she remembered, lacking the sharpness, the control. She tilted her head slightly. "Everett?" He hesitated again, as if unsure what to say. She waited, watching him, letting the silence stretch. Savannah recovered first. She let out a fake laugh, her grip on Everett tightening possessively. "Well, this is unexpected." Evelyn arched an eyebrow. "Is it?" Savannah's lips twitched. "I mean, what are the odds?" Evelyn gave her a slow, measured smile. Considering how small New York is, Savannah's eye twitched. Everett, however, just looked tired. For the first time, Evelyn noticed something else about him, something missing. His watch. The watch she had given him on their 20th anniversary, the one he had always worn because it was a status symbol, because it was an indicator of success. He never went anywhere without it, and now it was gone. A tiny detail, but one that spoke volumes. Savannah tugged at his sleeve. "Let's go," she said, her voice slightly sharper now, less controlled. Everett had hesitated for just a second longer, eyes lingering on Evelyn, and then, without another word, he let Savannah pull him away. Evelyn watched as they disappeared down the street, her heart pounding, but not from pain. Fen frais, ren satisfaction. Savannah had won that night in the penthouse. She had taken everything, her home, her life, her husband, and yet here they were. Savannah wasn't happy. And Everett, he looked like a man who had realized too late that he had made the biggest mistake of his life. Evelyn turned and walked back inside. Head held high, she had no reason to look back. Evelyn returned to work as if nothing had happened, but the encounter with Everett and Savannah lingered in her mind, not because it hurt. It didn't. Not in the way it once would have. What unsettled her was how different he had looked. Not the arrogant, untouchable businessman she had once known, but something else entirely. Something lesser. She pushed the thought aside, throwing herself into the routine of the bakery. There were pastries to prepare, orders to take, customers to serve. Life moved forward, and she had no intention of letting them distract her from what she was building. But fate, as it often did, had other plans. The first sign of Everett's unraveling came unexpectedly, in the form of hushed whispers among the bakery's customers. Evelyn hadn't been paying attention at first, but then she heard his name, Everett Anderson. She stilled, her hands tightening around the coffee cup she had been preparing. Two women sat at a corner table, their heads close together, scrolling through something on a phone. "Did you see this?" one murmured. "I knew something was going on with him," the other woman gasped. "Savannah's gone." Evelyn's breath caught. She forced herself to keep moving, pretending not to hear, but as soon as she had a free moment, she slipped into the back, grabbed her own phone, and searched his name. And there it was. A headline: business owner mogul Everett Anderson faces financial crisis as personal life crumbles. She clicked on the article, her heart pounding. It detailed how Everett had suffered significant financial losses over the past few months. Bad investments, failed deals, risky ventures that hadn't paid off. And then, buried between paragraphs of business jargon, one simple but explosive sentence. Sources close to the businessman report that his fiancée, Savannah Monroe, has ended their relationship and left their shared home last week. Evelyn blinked. Savannah was gone. She scrolled further, reading through the speculation. Some sources claimed Savannah had drained him financially before leaving. Others suggested she had never intended to stay long-term, that she had been waiting for the moment Everett was no longer useful to her. Evelyn exhaled, a strange mixture of emotions swirling inside her. She should have felt satisfied, she should have felt vindicated, but mostly, she felt nothing. Savannah had taken everything from her once, and now she had done the same to him. The irony was almost poetic. That evening, as she locked up the bakery, she expected to go home and move on from the news, just as she had with everything else. But fate wasn't done with her yet. She had barely stepped onto the sidewalk when she saw him, Everett. He was standing across the street, half hidden in the shadows. Staring at the bakery at her, Evelyn froze. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, as if making a decision, Everett started walking toward her. She considered leaving, slipping back inside and locking the door. But no, she wouldn't run from him, so she stood her ground. He stopped a few feet away, his face unreadable. Up close, he looked worse than he had the last time she had seen him. His suit, though still tailored, looked slightly rumpled, as if he hadn't cared enough to press it properly. His eyes had a tiredness she had never seen before. "Evelyn?" he said, his voice quieter than she remembered. She tilted her head. "Everett?" A pause, then, to her absolute shock, he let out a bitter laugh. "I bet you already know," he muttered. She didn't have to ask what he meant. "Savannah? The money? The downfall?" Evelyn crossed her arms. It's hard to avoid the news when your name is in the headlines. Everett let out a slow breath. Running a hand through his hair, he sighed. I guess I deserve that. Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken history. Evelyn expected him to be angry, to try and blame her for his misfortune, as if she had somehow orchestrated all of this. But instead, he just looked exhausted. She's gone, he admitted, his voice stripped of the arrogance and control it once exuded. Evelyn arched an eyebrow, her gaze steady. I know, he chuckled softly, but there was no trace of humor in the sound. Of course you do. You always knew what was coming before I did. She didn't deny it. For years she had seen the cracks in his life before he had. She had tried to warn him, to offer help, to hold things together when he was too blind to notice what was falling apart. But not anymore. Evelyn looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, she didn't see the man who had broken her. She saw a man breaking himself. Why are you here, Everett? She asked, her voice calm and unwavering. He hesitated, searching for the right words, and then, softly, almost painfully, he replied, I don't know. That was the worst part, wasn't it? He didn't know. He had spent his life defining himself through power, wealth, and control. And now, stripped of those things, he was lost. Adrift in a world that no longer bent to his will. Evelyn should have felt pity, but she didn't. She had once begged for his kindness, had once believed in his promises. She had been cast aside, humiliated, left to pick up the shattered remnants of a life she thought they had built together. And now she was standing here, stronger than ever, while he stood before her, lost and broken. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about vindication. It was justice. Everett took a slow step back, as if realizing that there was nothing left for him here. I'm sorry, he murmured, his voice barely audible. Evelyn blinked, surprised that he had even said the words. She never thought she would hear them from him, but it was too late. Too late for apologies, too late for redemption. She let the silence speak for her. Everett nodded as if he already knew what her response would be, and without another word, he turned and walked away. Evelyn watched him disappear into the city, into the life he had chosen. And then, without hesitation, she turned and walked back inside her bakery. Her life, her future, and she didn't look back. The scent of freshly brewed coffee intertwined with the warm, buttery aroma of baked goods as Evelyn carefully arranged the last of the pastries in the glass display case. Outside, the city was awakening, horns honking in the distance, footsteps tapping against the pavement, and the murmur of people beginning their day. The bakery had become her sanctuary, a place where she wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. Every morning she moved through the space with purpose, her hands no longer hesitant as she prepared dough, steamed milk, or greeted regular customers by name. But something had changed. She wasn't just working anymore, she was watching, learning, absorbing. She took note of things she once would have overlooked. How Theodore calculated costs and managed suppliers. How inventory was tracked. How pricing was adjusted based on the seasons. How small decisions impacted the bakery's success. And then, one day, the realization hit her with startling clarity. She didn't just want to work in a bakery, she wanted to own one. The idea had started as a whisper, a quiet possibility lurking at the back of her mind. But as the weeks passed, it grew louder, more insistent, until she could no longer ignore it. Could she really do it? Did she have what it took? The old Evelyn, Everett's Evelyn, would have doubted herself. But the woman she was now, the woman who had rebuilt herself from the ground up, she was ready. The thought stayed with her, simmering just beneath the surface, until one afternoon, when the lunch rush had died down and she found herself alone with Theodore in the small back office. She had planned to wait, to think things through more, but the words came out before she could stop them. I want to open my own bakery. Theodore, who had been reviewing a list of supplier orders, didn't react right away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression that was unreadable. Then, finally, Theodore smirked. Took you long enough to say it out loud? Evelyn blinked. You knew? He chuckled, shaking his head. Of course I knew. You've been looking at the numbers more, asking questions. You've got that look. She tilted her head. What look? Theodore leaned forward, elbows resting on the desk. The one people get when they're ready for something bigger. Evelyn exhaled slowly. I don't know where to start. Theodore nodded as if he expected that. That's the first thing you need to know. Nobody does. You just start anyway. She hesitated. How did you do it? For a moment, Theodore's face changed, a flicker of something deep, almost melancholic, crossing his features. I spent years in finance, he said after a long pause. Made good money, but I wasn't happy. My wife, he hesitated, his voice quieter now, she passed away, and I realized I had spent more time in boardrooms than at home with her. Evelyn swallowed, suddenly understanding him in a way she hadn't before. The Theodore continued, his voice steady. So I walked away from it all, took what I had, found a small space and just started. It wasn't easy. I made mistakes, almost lost everything more than once. But I figured it out. He smirked, though his eyes still held traces of something heavier. And now you want to do the same? Evelyn nodded slowly. Theodore studied her before smirking again. You sure you're ready for that kind of risk? Evelyn met his gaze, unflinching. I've lost everything before. I survived. I'll survive this too. Theodore let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. All right, Anderson, let's talk logistics. For the next hour, he walked her through the realities of owning a business. The costs, the risks, the grind it would take, renting a space, buying equipment, finding the right location, marketing, customer loyalty. She wrote everything down, taking in every word, soaking up knowledge like a sponge. By the time they finished, her notebook was filled with notes, calculations, and ideas. Her mind was buzzing. This wasn't just a dream anymore. It was a plan. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't complete, but it was real. That night, as she walked home, she let herself imagine. She pictured her own bakery. Not a replica of Theodore's, but something uniquely hers. A place filled with warmth, where people didn't just buy pastries, but came for the experience. Where the scent of vanilla and cinnamon filled the air. Where she knew her customers by name. A place that reflected who she had become, not who she had once been. For the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't dared to hope for. Excitement. She wasn't trapped anymore. She wasn't Everett's Evelyn anymore. She was free. And she was going to build something of her own. The idea of owning her own bakery no longer felt like a distant dream. It had taken root in her mind, growing with each passing day, becoming something real, something possible. But knowing she wanted it and making it happen were two entirely different things. Evelyn had spent the last few weeks immersed in research. Her free time was consumed by books, online articles, and late-night brainstorming sessions. Every spare moment she was jotting down notes, calculating costs, sketching out ideas for layouts and menus. But no amount of research could change the one inescapable truth. She needed money. Theodore had been a patient mentor, guiding her through the realities of business ownership. He never sugar-coated things, and for that, she was grateful. Every night after closing, they sat in the back office, surrounded by stacks of invoices and receipts, where he explained cash flow, expenses, and the delicate balance of running a profitable bakery. One evening, as she pored over spreadsheets, Theodore leaned back in his chair, watching her with an amused smirk. You've got that look, he said. Evelyn glanced up. What look? The I'm about to overthink myself into exhaustion look? She exhaled, rubbing her temples. I just don't know how I'm going to afford this. I found a place that could work, but even with the lowest rental options, I'm still way short. Theodore nodded thoughtfully. How much do you have saved? She hesitated before answering. Not enough. Loans? He suggested. Evelyn bit her lip. I don't like the idea of being in debt. Theodore chuckled. That's the price of business, Anderson. Every entrepreneur takes risks. You either borrow money or find someone who believes in you enough to invest. Evelyn frowned, deep in thought. Investors. She didn't like the idea of someone else having control over her dream. She wanted this to be hers, built from the ground up, without strings attached. I need another option, she murmured, staring at the list of costs. Something that doesn't leave me in debt to a bank or at the mercy of an investor. Theodore tilted his head. Family? Evelyn stiffened. The word sent a ripple of discomfort through her. Her family had never needed her before. Vivienne, her younger sister, had been the independent one, the one who had built her own life, worked hard, and never relied on anyone. Meanwhile, Evelyn had been the perfect wife, the polished socialite, the woman who never had to struggle. They had drifted apart over the years. When Evelyn married Everett, she had immersed herself in his world, neglecting the bond she once had with Vivienne. After the divorce, she hadn't reached out, not because she didn't care, but because she didn't know how. But maybe it was time. The idea lingered as she left the bakery that night, the city buzzing with life around her. As she walked home, Evelyn kept replaying old memories in her mind. Holidays with Vivienne, late-night talks when they were younger, the way Vivienne had always looked at her, like she wanted her to be more than just someone's wife. Evelyn unlocked her apartment door, tossing her bag onto the small table in the corner. The space was modest, nothing like the luxury penthouse she once called home, but it was hers. She sat down, staring at her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. It had been months since she had spoken to Vivienne. Would she even pick up? Taking a deep breath, Evelyn pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Evelyn? There was hesitation in Vivienne's tone, a mixture of surprise and something else. Caution, maybe. Evelyn swallowed. Hey, Vivienne. A pause. It's good to hear from you, Vivienne said slowly, as if unsure whether or not she meant it. Evelyn exhaled, gripping the edge of the table. I need your help. Another pause. Then, tell me everything. For the first time in years, Evelyn did. She told Vivienne about Everett, about the way he had thrown her out, about the nights she had spent feeling lost. She told her about Theodore, the bakery, how she had started over with nothing but determination and a little bit of luck. And finally, she told her about her dream, about the bakery she wanted to open, about the space she had found, about the passion she had discovered for something she never knew she loved. When she finished, there was silence. Evelyn braced herself for judgment, for skepticism, for the "I told you so" she had been expecting. But instead, Vivienne let out a slow breath. Wow, she said. I mean, wow. Evelyn ran a hand through her hair. I know. It's a lot. Vivienne laughed softly. No, Evelyn, it's amazing. Evelyn blinked. You think so? Of course, Vivienne said, her voice more certain now. I always knew you had more in you than that ridiculous country club life. I just didn't think you'd ever see it for yourself. Evelyn swallowed the lump in her throat. I see it now. Vivienne was quiet for a moment before speaking again. How much do you need? Evelyn hesitated. Vivienne, I didn't call to ask for money. I know, Vivienne interrupted. But I want to help. You're finally doing something for yourself. And if there's one thing I believe in, it's women building their own damn empires. A small, shaky laugh escaped Evelyn's lips. She hadn't expected this. Not the warmth, not the unwavering support, not the ease with which Vivienne had forgiven the years of silence between them. You really think I can do this? Evelyn asked, almost afraid of the answer. Vivienne's voice was steady. Evelyn, you already are. Tears burned at the edges of Evelyn's eyes as she nodded, even though Vivienne couldn't see her. They spent the next hour going over numbers, discussing potential options. Vivienne offered to lend her a portion of the money, not as a handout, but as an investment. Evelyn promised to pay her back. Vivienne didn't seem to care. By the time they ended the call, Evelyn felt lighter than she had in months. For so long, she had believed she was alone in this journey. But now, she realized she wasn't. She had support, she had a future, and for the first time in years, she had her sister back. That night, as she lay in bed, Evelyn let herself dream, not just of a bakery, but of everything that came with it. The freedom, the independence, the life she was about to create. This wasn't just a new beginning, it was her second chance. And she wasn't going to waste it. The morning after her conversation with Vivienne, Evelyn woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. The familiar hum of the city outside her window felt different today, almost like it was welcoming her into the next chapter of her life. She had spent months feeling like she was rebuilding from nothing. But now, for the first time, she felt like she had a foundation. She arrived at the bakery earlier than usual, pushing through the glass doors just as the sun was rising over the skyline. The smell of fresh dough and warm cinnamon filled the air, wrapping around her like a comforting embrace. Theodore was already there as always, sleeves rolled up, hands covered in flour as he worked the dough for the morning's bread. He barely glanced up when she walked in. "You're early," he muttered, kneading the dough with practiced ease. Evelyn grabbed an apron and tied it around her waist, feeling more at home in this space than she ever had in the cold, sterile world she had once belonged to. The penthouse she once lived in felt like a distant memory. "I needed to talk to you," she said, stepping up to the counter beside him. The Theodore finally looked at her, raising an eyebrow. "That serious?" Evelyn exhaled, feeling a weight settle in her chest. Not the weight of doubt, but the magnitude of what she was about to say out loud. "I found a way to fund my bakery," she said, the words both terrifying and exhilarating. Theodore stopped kneading, wiping his hands on a towel before turning to face her fully. "You did?" She nodded. "My sister, Vivian." Theodore studied her, his expression unreadable. "Haven't heard you mention family before," Evelyn hesitated. "We haven't talked in a long time. Not really, she sighed, running a hand through her hair. "When I was married to Everett, I let a lot of things slip away, including my relationship with her." Theodore nodded, as if he understood more than he was letting on. "And now she's helping you?" Evelyn smiled, still almost in disbelief. "She believes in me. She offered to invest, not as a handout, but because she thinks I can actually make this work." Theodore leaned back against the counter, arms crossed. "She's smart." Evelyn let out a small laugh. "I think so too." He watched her for a long moment before smirking. "So, what's next?" She felt her pulse quicken. This was real now. No more hesitation, no more waiting. "I'm going to put in an offer on that space in Brooklyn," she said, gripping the counter to steady herself. "It's exactly what I want. Small, cozy, with great foot traffic. I already spoke to the realtor. If I move fast, it's mine." Theodore nodded in approval. "Good." Evelyn took a deep breath. "And I want your help." That made him pause. "Help how?" She swallowed. "You built this bakery from nothing. You know what works, what doesn't. I don't just want to learn from books, I want to learn from you." Theodore was silent for a moment, then sighed, shaking his head. "You really don't like doing things the easy way, do you?" Evelyn grinned. "Where's the fun in that?" He smirked. "All right, Anderson, I'll help. But only if you promise me one thing." She tilted her head. "What's that?" His eyes held something almost fatherly, though he'd never admit it. "Don't ever doubt yourself again. You're meant for this." Her throat tightened, emotions swelling inside her. She nodded. "Deal." The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings, paperwork, and decisions. Vivian helped her finalize the financial details, her sharp business sense proving invaluable. The landlord accepted her offer, and just like that, the space in Brooklyn was hers. The first time she stepped into it as the owner, she felt her heart race. The walls were bare, the floors scuffed, the counters empty, but to Evelyn it was already alive with possibility. She ran her fingers over the cool marble of the future display counter, envisioning trays of fresh pastries lined up, customers sipping coffee at small wooden tables, the scent of vanilla and cinnamon filling the air. It was hers. For the first time in her life, something was hers. That night, she called Vivienne, sitting on the floor of her new bakery, surrounded by blueprints and sketches. "It's official," she said, unable to keep the excitement from her voice. "I have a bakery." Vivienne laughed on the other end of the line. "Damn right you do, and I expect free pastries for life." Evelyn smiled. "Deal." As she ended the call, she leaned back against the wall, staring at the empty space in front of her. There was so much to do, so many challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. She was ready. Evelyn stood in the middle of her soon-to-be bakery, the weight of everything she had built pressing against her chest. The space was still empty, bare walls, scuffed floors, and dust lingering in the corners. But to her, it was already alive. She could hear the imagined hum of conversation, the clinking of coffee cups against ceramic saucers. The rustling of newspapers as customers sipped their morning espresso. She could smell the fresh bread baking in the ovens, the rich scent of vanilla and cinnamon wrapping around the air like an embrace. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking it all in. This was hers, after everything she had endured, after losing everything she thought defined her. She was standing inside something that she had built from the ground up. There was no Everett here, no Savannah, no reminders of the past she had left behind. Just Evelyn. And that was enough. She spent the next few weeks working tirelessly, pouring herself into every detail of the bakery. The first step was transforming the space into something warm, inviting, and uniquely hers. She didn't want it to feel like a generic coffee shop. She wanted it to be an experience. A place where people came to find comfort, where they could sit for hours with a book and a pastry, where strangers could become regulars, and regulars could become friends. She spent hours scouring antique stores and second-hand markets for the perfect furniture, wooden tables with character, chairs that felt sturdy but comfortable, light fixtures that cast a soft, golden glow rather than the harsh brightness of commercial lighting. Every piece had to feel intentional. Theodore accompanied her on a few trips, grumbling the entire time about how she was too picky, but she could tell he was enjoying it. "You know, most people just buy new stuff and call it a day," he said as she ran her hand over a distressed oak table, checking for just the right texture. Evelyn smirked. "I want people to feel at home when they walk in." Theodore shook his head, but couldn't hide his amusement. "You're turning into a real business owner, Anderson." The realization hit her in that moment. She was a business owner. She wasn't just working towards something anymore. She was living it. Once the space started coming together, she turned her attention to what mattered most. The food. Evelyn spent night after night perfecting her menu. She didn't want to offer generic pastries that could be found in any cafe. She wanted every item to tell a story, to have a purpose. She experimented with flavors, filling her small apartment kitchen with the scent of caramelized sugar, melting butter, and toasted almonds. Some nights were frustrating. Recipes that should have worked failed miserably, leaving her scrubbing burnt sugar off baking sheets at 2 a.m. But then, there were nights when everything clicked. One evening, after weeks of trial and error, she pulled a tray of croissants from the oven, flaky, golden, and filled with vanilla bean custard, their tops lightly caramelized to create a delicate crunch with every bite. She hesitated before taking the first bite, letting the flavors melt together. The contrast of crisp pastry and smooth custard perfectly balanced. It was her pastry, the one that would define her bakery. The next morning she brought a batch to Theodore's shop, placing them on the counter without a word. Theodore raised an eyebrow, taking one and inspecting it. He took a bite, chewing thoughtfully as she watched him nervously. Then he smirked. "Damn, Anderson," he said, finishing it off. "You're going to make me look bad." Relief and pride rushed through her. That was all the validation she needed. With the menu finalized, the bakery nearing completion, and the lease officially signed, the last step was staffing. She wanted to create an environment where people actually enjoyed working, where they felt like they were part of something, not just punching in and out for a paycheck. She spent an entire week interviewing potential employees, choosing carefully, looking for people who shared her vision. She hired Stella first. There was never a question about that. Stella had been with her since the beginning, supporting her, cheering her on. The thought of opening her doors without Stella at the counter was unthinkable. Then came Gabriel, a barista with an infectious energy, someone who could make anyone feel welcome within seconds of walking through the door. Finally, she hired Elara, a pastry assistant with a quiet passion for baking, someone who reminded Evelyn of herself in the early days at Theodore's bakery, full of potential and eager to learn. With a team in place, the bakery felt real in a way it never had before. The night before the grand opening, Evelyn stood in the middle of her now fully transformed space. The wooden tables were in place, each one set with small vases of fresh flowers. The counters gleamed under the warm lights. The smell of freshly baked bread lingered in the air, even though the ovens had long been turned off for the night. She could hear the faint hum of the city outside. But inside, it was quiet. Peaceful. Vivian called as she was locking up, her voice full of excitement. "Are you ready?" she asked. Evelyn exhaled, looking around. "Yeah," she said softly. "I really am." Vivian laughed. "I hope you know I expect a lifetime supply of free pastries." Evelyn smiled. Only if you come pick them up in person." As she ended the call, she stood outside her bakery, looking up at the sign she had fought so hard for. Her name was on it. Not Everett's, not anyone else's, just hers. She had built something out of nothing, and tomorrow her legacy would begin, and she was ready. The sun had barely risen when Evelyn arrived at her bakery, but the city was already waking up around her. The distant hum of traffic, the occasional bark of a dog being walked by its owner, the murmurs of early risers heading to work. It was the quiet symphony of a new beginning. She stood outside for a moment, staring at the sign above the door, her name, written in elegant script, her name. It was still surreal, the idea that this place belonged to her. Not to Everett, not to someone who dictated her worth. It was hers, built from the ground up with nothing but resilience, passion, and the belief that she was capable of more than anyone had ever given her credit for. Taking a deep breath, she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The scent of fresh coffee and vanilla from the night's last test batch lingered in the air, filling the space with warmth. Everything was in place. Tables set, pastries prepped, the espresso machine gleaming under the soft morning light. She ran her fingers across the countertop, feeling the smooth wood beneath her palm. Months ago, she had nothing. No home, no money, no direction. And now, she was about to open the doors to her business, ready to serve her very first customers. Stella arrived next, stepping inside with a grin and 2 coffees in hand. "You didn't think I'd let you start your first day without caffeine, did you?" Evelyn laughed, taking the cup with gratitude. "You are a lifesaver." Stella took a sip of her own drink, looking around the bakery. "Damn, Em, you really did it." Evelyn exhaled, shaking her head. "Yeah, I guess I did." Gabriel and Alara arrived soon after, both buzzing with excitement. They immediately got to work, making final adjustments to the display case, organizing the barista station, double-checking the first round of orders. As the opening hour approached, a nervous energy settled in Evelyn's chest. What if no one showed up? What if they had done all this work for nothing? But then, just minutes before the doors were set to open, she glanced outside, and her heart stopped. There was a line. A small crowd of people had gathered outside, bundled in coats, talking amongst themselves. Waiting. Some were strangers, drawn in by the smell of fresh bread wafting through the air. Others were friends, people she had met over the months, people who had followed her journey, and they wanted to be part of it. Standing near the front of the line was Vivian Evelyn, pressed her lips together, overwhelmed with emotion. Her sister caught her gaze through the window and smirked, lifting a hand in greeting. Stella nudged her. "I told you, they're here for you." Evelyn swallowed past the lump in her throat. This was really happening. She took a deep breath, smoothed the front of her apron, and walked to the door. The moment she had been waiting for, she turned the sign from closed to open, then unlocked the door and let them in. The next few hours were a blur of movement, laughter, and the intoxicating rhythm of success. The bakery filled with life, the sound of the espresso machine steaming milk, the chime of the cash register, the warm greetings exchanged between customers. Stella worked the counter effortlessly, taking orders with her usual charm. Gabriel crafted each coffee with precision, his movements swift and fluid. Alara moved through the kitchen like she had been doing it for years, her hands dusted with flour as she pulled fresh pastries from the oven. And Alara, she was everywhere, checking on customers, making sure the pastries were perfect, ensuring that every single person who walked through her doors felt welcome. An hour in, Vivian finally made it to the counter, arms crossed with an amused expression. "So, do I get my free lifetime supply of pastries, or do I have to put in an order like everyone else?" Evelyn smirked. "Only if you promise to keep coming back." Vivian reached across the counter, squeezing Evelyn's hand. "You did this, Em, and I've never been prouder." The words hit her like a wave, but instead of knocking her down, they lifted her up. She wasn't just someone's ex-wife. She wasn't just a woman who had been abandoned. She was Evelyn Anderson, business owner, baker, survivor. By midday, the bakery was packed. The line stretched out the door. The pastries were selling faster than they could bring them out. Theodore showed up at one point, arms crossed as he surveyed the place with a smirk. "All right, Anderson," he said as he reached the counter. "I'll admit it, You didn't screw this up." Evelyn laughed, shaking her head. "High praise coming from you." Theodore leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I'm proud of you, kid. You deserve this." Evelyn's throat tightened, but before she could respond, he nodded toward the pastry case. "Now give me one of those croissants before they sell out." The day passed in a whirlwind, but as the last customer left and she locked the doors, Evelyn finally let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. They had done it. Her team cheered, exhaustion and joy mixing in equal measure. Stella flopped into a chair. "That was insane." Gabriel stretched his arms. "And we get to do it all over again tomorrow," Alara grinned. "I can't wait." Evelyn stood in the center of the bakery, looking at the space. Filled with life, filled with her dreams made real. She had built this. And it was only the beginning. The days following the grand opening of Evelyn's bakery were a whirlwind of exhaustion, excitement, and something she hadn't felt in years. Fulfillment. Every morning before the sun even rose, she was already inside, rolling out fresh dough, measuring ingredients with precision, ensuring that everything was perfect before the first customer stepped through the door. Word spread fast. By the end of the first week, the bakery was already developing a reputation. Customers came back, not just for the pastries, but for the atmosphere, the warmth of the place. The inviting scent of vanilla and caramel filled the air. The soft hum of conversation mixed with the occasional clinking of cups against saucers. It was exactly how Evelyn had envisioned it. She watched as Stella greeted regulars like old friends, as Gabriel perfected each cappuccino with practiced ease, as Alara moved through the kitchen, her passion evident in every pastry she created. And Evelyn was alive. She had spent years living in Everett's shadow, confined to the role of the perfect wife, a woman who existed only to support someone else's success. Now she was standing on her own, creating something that was hers, something that no one could take away. But with success came pressure. The demand was growing faster than she had anticipated. Supplies had to be reordered constantly, and there were moments she worried, were they doing too well too soon? How do people even know about us this quickly? Evelyn asked one afternoon as Stella wiped down the counter between rushes. Stella smirked, tossing her rag over her shoulder. "Turns out people love to talk about food, and you know that influencer who came in on opening day?" Evelyn frowned. "The one who took 1,000,000 pictures," Stella grinned. "She posted a video about us. It already has 200,000 views." Evelyn's eyes widened. 20,000? Stella nodded. "And climbing. We're officially a thing, boss." Evelyn exhaled, running a hand through her hair. She had no idea what was coming next, but for the first time in her life, she was ready. She had dreamed of success, but this level of growth, so fast, was overwhelming. She didn't want to fail. She couldn't fail. That night, after the last customer had left and the doors were locked, she sat at one of the empty tables, flipping through the numbers, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. "Don't overthink it." Theodore's voice broke through her thoughts. Evelyn glanced up to see him leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, a knowing look on his face. She sighed. "I just want to make sure I don't screw this up." Theodore walked over, pulling out a chair across from her. "You won't, but you're going to burn out if you don't pace yourself." Evelyn frowned. "I can't afford to slow down." Theodore studied her for a moment before shaking his head. "Listen, Anderson, you built this. You made it happen, but now you have to trust it. You've got a solid team. Let them do their jobs. You don't have to do everything alone." Evelyn wanted to argue, to tell him that she had to be in control, that she couldn't let even the smallest thing slip. But deep down, she knew he was right. She had spent so much time proving herself, she hadn't stopped to think about what came next. The next morning, she made a decision. Instead of micromanaging every detail, she delegated more. Giving Stella more control over customer service, letting Gabriel handle more of the coffee operations, trusting Alara to experiment with new recipes. It felt strange at first, stepping back. But by the end of the week, she realized something. The bakery didn't fall apart without her controlling every single aspect. It thrived, and for the first time, she allowed herself to breathe. But just as everything seemed to be settling into place, The past came knocking. It was late one evening when she saw him. She had just stepped outside to lock up when she caught sight of a familiar figure across the street. Everett! Her breath caught in her throat. He looked different, the confidence, the arrogance, gone. His once perfectly tailored suit was slightly wrinkled, his stance unsure, as if he wasn't quite certain he should be there. Evelyn stood frozen for a moment before forcing herself to breathe. She wasn't the same woman he had abandoned, and he wasn't the man who had once controlled her world. Slowly, she stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "Evelyn," Everett said, his voice quieter than she remembered. She tilted her head. "Everett?" A beat of silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken history. "I heard about your bakery," he admitted. He hesitated, looking away for a moment. "I wanted to see it." Evelyn crossed her arms, studying him. "Why?" He exhaled, shaking his head. I don't know." She waited, but he didn't say more. He looked lost. A man who had built his identity on power and wealth, only to find himself without either. Evelyn had spent so long thinking about what she would say if she ever saw him again. Would she tell him off? Would she make him feel the pain he had caused her? Would she take pleasure in seeing him at his lowest? But standing there now, looking at the man who had once broken her, she felt nothing. No anger, no resentment, just Vivianarities. She had survived without him. She had built something better than he ever could have given her. And she didn't need closure from him. She had already found it within herself. She straightened her shoulders. "I should get going. I have a business to run." Everett looked like he wanted to say something else, but he didn't, and Evelyn... She turned, walked back into her bakery, and didn't look back. The encounter with Everett should have lingered in Evelyn's mind, should have haunted her, the way his voice once did, but it didn't. She had expected to feel something, anger, sadness, maybe even a shred of pity. Instead, she felt nothing. It was as if she had spoken to a ghost, a relic of a past that no longer had any bearing on her. And that was how she knew she had truly won. Not in the way Everett had always measured success. With money, power, or control, no. She had won because she had rebuilt herself. She had created a new life, one in which she was not an accessory to a man's ego, not someone's afterthought, but a woman who had carved her own future with her own hands. And now, standing inside her bakery, surrounded by the warmth of fresh bread, the hum of conversation, and the clinking of coffee cups, she felt something even greater than pride. She felt peace. The morning rush had already begun when Evelyn stepped inside. Gabriel was behind the counter, expertly pulling shots of espresso, while Stella moved through the crowd with ease, taking orders, cracking jokes that made customers smile. In the kitchen, Ilara was completely in her element. Her hands covered in flour as she carefully piped filling into a fresh batch of eclairs. Evelyn took it all in, a quiet pride swelling in her chest. This was more than a business, it was a home. We need more almond croissants," Stella called from the front, already balancing a tray of lattes in one hand. "On it!" Evelyn rolled up her sleeves, slipping into the rhythm of the kitchen as if it were second nature. The next few hours passed in a blur of movement, kneading dough, rolling pastries, checking on customers. She barely had time to breathe. But she wouldn't have it any other way. The bakery was alive, thriving, filled with people who had already made it a part of their routine. There were regulars now. Mrs. Matteo, who always came in for a cappuccino and a raspberry scone. The young couple who sat by the window every Saturday morning, lost in quiet conversation over shared pastries. The exhausted college student who showed up at the same time every evening, laptop in hand, always ordering the strongest coffee on the menu. She knew them by name, by habit, by the way they belonged here. This was what she had dreamed of. Midway through the afternoon, Vivienne walked in. Sunglasses perched on top of her head, a smirk on her lips. "All right, let's see if this place is still as good as I remember." "Standing?" she teased, leaning against the counter. Evelyn rolled her eyes. "Barely. It's been chaos all morning." Vivienne glanced around. "The good kind of chaos, though." Evelyn exhaled, nodding. "Yeah, the best kind." Vivienne studied her for a moment before tilting her head. "So, what's next?" Vivienne grinned. You think this is it? You've made it now? So what's the next step? Evelyn hesitated, glancing around the bakery. She hadn't thought past this moment, past building something that lasted, but now that she was here, now that she had done it, a new thought crept into her mind. Could she expand? Could she grow this into something even bigger? The idea no longer scared her. One step at a time, Vivienne, she said finally, but her mind was already racing. The day flew by, and by the time they locked up for the night, Evelyn was exhausted, but it was the kind of exhaustion that felt earned. Her team collapsed into chairs, sighing in relief. Stella stretched her arms above her head. I think we broke a record today. Gabriel leaned back, rubbing his face. Pretty sure I made about 100 lattes. Lara just grinned, already flipping through a notebook filled with recipe ideas. Evelyn watched them, warmth spreading through her chest. They weren't just employees, they were family. As the others said their goodbyes and headed home, Evelyn lingered in the bakery, running her fingers over the smooth surface of the counter. The space was quiet now, the air still carrying traces of cinnamon and espresso. She thought about the woman she had been. The one who had lived in a house so big it never felt like home. The one who had let someone else dictate her worth. The one who had once believed she wasn't capable of anything more. And then, she thought about the woman she was now. Resilient, strong, independent. She wasn't someone's wife, she wasn't someone's mistake. She was Evelyn Anderson, and she had built a life that belonged entirely to her. Tomorrow she would wake up before dawn, roll out fresh dough, and do it all over again, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Because she had finally found where she was meant to be. And this was just the beginning. Did you enjoy this story? If so, drop a like and leave a kind comment to encourage us. Your support means the world. And don't forget, we love you.